Okay, Talia, what would make this an especially meaningful conversation for you today?
I guess feeling more prepared and learning the strategies to tackle the LSAT. I think a part of tackling the LSAT is definitely having the right mindset in terms of like knowing how to approach the questions, knowing how to have just the right strength throughout the test in terms of, not giving up by like the last section, which I think that's one of like my struggles. So I think knowing how to conquer this test would also be confident in like the questions and also just confident in my own strategy when tackling the test.
Sure, sure. Are there any particular areas where you're struggling, where you feel like you could use more confidence?
Yeah, I think LR in
LR.
general. Yeah, not my favorite at all.
Okay, tell me more. What's your experience with LR like right now?
So right now, it's been one of those things where I've realized it's like a section that I need to spend the most time on, especially, and it makes sense because it's a huge part of the test. And so right now, like when I've been practicing on my own, I'm so good when I'm like studying and I can like map everything out and draw like, those little diagrams between like the premises and the conclusion. But I think when it's actually like test time and I'm practicing, I always like freeze up because I'm like, okay, I'm thinking about time. I'm thinking about how I won't be able to like read everything. So that results into me like reading fast. And so I think one of my biggest downsides in LR has been like trying to move so quickly and then missing out on like key information that would have made me like do the question much faster.
Right. Okay, so Talia, what's your goal score on the LSAT?
My goal score is a 170.
170. Okay.
Yeah.
So you do want to answer every single question on the test.
Yeah.
You do. But the thing is that you don't have to attempt every single question when you come across it. It's okay to flag questions and come back to them later. Personally, I'll flag at least 3 or 4 questions in a single logical reasoning section because I say to myself, I do not want to deal with this right now. It's, making my head hurt. I just flag it, I skip it, come back to it later. That could be question number 17, question number 19, question number 21, or maybe a random earlier question, like maybe it's on a topic I don't like science or philosophy, or it's too abstractly worded. That's fine. You can always come back at the end.
Yeah.
And the digital LSAT actually has a flagging tool to make it really easy to do that. Have you tried experimenting with that at all?
I have. And so what I've done is that I guess the last time I did practice and take a digital LSAT, I just ran out of time completely, even though I did flag questions, because I'll write it down since like you can't really mark on like the digital LSAT which ones you're coming back to. So like I'll write it down on my paper. Then in the end, I ran out of time completely.
Mm-hmm. You should take a look at the digital LSAT familiarization tool because there actually is a flagging tool on there. So you can mark it. There's a little navigation bar at the bottom of the screen with all the questions listed, like 1 to 25. And when you flag a question to come back to, there's a little flag icon. You click it, it turns black, it fills in. You'll see that filled in on the bottom of the nav bar as well.
Okay, maybe because I guess I've been practicing on Khan Academy and taking those digital practice tests. Maybe
Yeah, the Khan ones are different.
Okay, yeah.
So
Perfect.
It's okay to flag a handful of questions to come back to later. You don't have to tackle every tough question in the moment. And you also don't want to get bogged down on those tough questions because that's when you start spiraling into stress around not getting to other stuff later.
Yeah.
Are there any logical reasoning question types in particular that give you trouble?
The most recent ones that I realized were assumption questions.
Okay, so with assumption, there's necessary assumption and sufficient assumption. Do you feel like you have a good handle on the difference?
I do.
Okay, awesome. Do you find one more difficult than the other?
I found necessary assumption more difficult.
Okay, how do you approach those right now?
So right now I've been like, I'll read the first, read the question stem, then and figure out which type of assumption question it is. And then I'll go in and read the stimulus and then identify the premises and then the conclusion. And then my first step after that is to think about possible objections immediately. And then once I think about the possible objections that I have in my head, I'm usually able to go to the answer choices and like eliminate 3 answer choices by then. And then usually I have 2 left that are like pretty good. And then I use the negation test.
Awesome. Perfect. So you're doing all the things that you should be doing on these. Yeah. I want to add one other tool to your toolkit, which is think of necessary assumption questions like a very specific kind of must be true question. Okay. They're not really asking you for new information. a person who believes in the stimulus, who is logically committed to the stimulus, is also logically committed to all underlying necessary assumptions. So like if you tell me that you have studied the LSAT thoroughly and you know all the different types of questions, then it must be the case, and I can assume that you also know about logic games, because logic games are a category within the umbrella of the LSAT. It wouldn't really be new information to know that you know about logic games if I already know that you know the LSAT as a whole. So treat them like inferences.
Yeah.
Awesome. A lot of times people will run from the correct answer on necessary assumption because it seems like it's too moderate, or we already know that, and they want stronger language. But for this type, we don't want anything new. We want something that we already knew based on the stimulus.
Yeah, I think that's what I've done too. And sometimes when I go back and like review some of my wrong answers that I chose, I realize, okay, you were between the right answer. And I'll have that initial like gut to pick the right answer, and I'll be like, oh no, that can't be it. That's not what that's not what they want. And then in reality, it is what they want.
Yeah, you just have to consider the question type in mind. Some question types you want more moderate language. Other types, more extreme language is perfectly fine. Like for sufficient assumption, it could be as extreme as you want, as long as it gets the job done.
Yeah.
So talk more to me about issues you're facing on the LSAT, other struggles you're having.
I think another, struggle that I'm having is identifying the flaw in general in like LR. And that's one of the things too, because I think my process, I haven't solidified a good process for identity flaw questions yet, in terms of like once I like identify the premises and the conclusion, and then like my general idea is like, okay, find the gap. And then that's where like I get stuck because I'm like, okay, I think it could be this or another option. And so I think for me, that is another area where I'm like, okay, I need to improve my strategy on that type of question.
Okay, so when we say, obviously you do want to find the gap, that is a flaw is a kind of gap, but there are also other ways you could frame it for yourself that might make it easier for you to predict where they're going with it, or to articulate it for yourself. So what if you ask yourself, what are they failing to consider? What alternative possibilities or explanations have they not considered? Or you could think about, for a flaw question, what have they mistakenly assumed that they should not have assumed? So those are just a couple of directions that you can take it. And a lot of flaw questions will fit the classic logical fallacy model of, let's say, correlation causation confusion, or personal attacks, or necessary sufficient confusion. But other times it is a little bit more open-ended and more particular to the argument itself, where they just didn't consider something that they should have, or they overextend themselves. Like they go from a could to a must, which is too extreme given the evidence. And I really do want you to try and predict or prephrase the flaw for yourself as you're doing. I think that's a good approach, because it's much easier to spot it in the choices if you already have a general sense of what to be looking for. It's like the argument's guilty of a crime, and you've got to articulate what that crime is. But looking at a random list of crimes is only going to potentially confuse you further, especially if they're in more like the abstract language.
I think that's also another challenge I've had in the flaw questions. When there is abstract language, I'm like, oh my God, because I feel like it's throwing me off. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like trying to think back, I guess, to the strategies and think about like how to, I guess, unpack all of the abstract language.
Yeah, and it'd be tough to do that in the moment, right? Because it's unfamiliar. That's what makes it hard. But as an exercise in the short term, you could actually just look up all those words you don't know, or all those phrases that are unfamiliar. Just Google them or define them in context. And so that when they come up again, you will better understand them, because they just repeat and repeat and repeat.
Yeah.
A lot of times the abstract language is just describing simple concepts in a more confusing way. So if you can relate the language to the concepts you already know, you've already solved the problem for yourself. And then as an exercise to go beyond one step further with that, you could actually look up other flaws that match that particular abstract language. So if they're describing necessary sufficient confusion, giving yourself an example of what that would look like in practice, or how could you modify the argument in the stimulus to match that other flaw instead? so that you would see how it would actually have to play out to match that wrong answer.
Yeah, no, that seems like a good practice.
So yeah, just open up any old section of logical reasoning and flip till you come across one of those and just go through all 5 choices and do that. It'll make a big difference.
Yeah.
Any other areas giving you trouble in particular?
Another big area that I'm having trouble with is reading comp, and I was a political science major, so I thought, okay, I'm like used to reading a bunch of like dense texts and things like that, but I think reading comp always throws me off because I try to read for every detail. And then like obviously every detail doesn't stay, and so I feel like one of my things there is like I'm not maximizing or using up all my time properly, and it's like I know I could if I just like read for like structure, which is what a bunch of strategies say, I could tackle all the questions more effectively. But it's one of the things that once I read a topic, I'm like, okay, I just naturally like want to like conquer the material, but it's definitely slowing me down as I'm on like practicing and taking the test.
Yeah, well, it is certainly about reading for structure rather than for details. What that looks like in practice is that anytime you see evidence or examples or supporting details or lists of things, you could essentially skip those. You should still know where they are so that you can go back and find them when you need them. But in the moment as you're reading, I would speed up for those portions. And then when you see any articulations of conclusions, theories, or hypotheses, essentially the author's opinion, that's where you want to slow down. And if nothing else, when you're done, you want to walk away with the author's opinion and the main idea, and that will usually knock out at least a couple of questions for you. Yeah. And for every passage, there is at least some point where they articulate that. And so as an exercise, you could go through several passages and just highlight for yourself, what is that main point? Where did it appear? Which specific lines?
Okay.
But you don't have to absorb all the details. You can go back for those particular questions when you need to. But I would aim to, in 2.5 to 3 minutes, walk away with the main idea and then knowing where those other things are so that you can find them when you need them.
Yeah.
Treat reading comprehension like a big logical reasoning stimulus or several big logical reasoning stimuli. That's all it is really, but you're looking for all the same things, evidence and conclusion. But in this case, conclusion is the viewpoints presented, and there could be multiple, of course, and then the evidence, which are all those details and supporting examples.
Yeah, I'll try thinking about it like that.
Yeah, and that's what the questions are geared for too. They're not geared specifically or solely for all the details. They really are focused more on the big picture. There's general questions where the author's opinion will get you most of the way there. Then there's the local ones, which are the detail-oriented ones, but they often have some sort of reference back to the passage. And in the paper LSAT, they give you line references. On the digital LSAT, they'll highlight the key phrase in both the question stem and the passage. And then finally, you'll have those more inferential questions that require reading between the lines, but those are also a bit more general in nature as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you do any kind of note-taking for reading comp?
I do.
What do you do?
So usually I if I notice like a change in language in terms of like the shifting tone, I'll probably note that down, like which line that is. I usually note if I find the conclusion where that is already. And then in terms of like highlighting, I'll like highlight like weird terminology sometimes that like I feel like might come up in a question. And then like most times it does come up in a question. But then I'll also highlight like analogies when they come up, because that's something I found that like that also becomes a question in itself. And so technically I would usually try to get some important details, but mostly like the main conclusion, if there's a change in tone, where I can find the author's opinion and things like that.
Good. Yeah. So you're looking at all the right things. I would simply suggest scale down what you're looking for to simply the main idea. And you could write that on your scratch paper. What's the main idea? And if you want to note a couple of key words about the different viewpoints, you could do that too. But I wouldn't spend too much time on it, honestly. Just know where things are to go back when you need to.
Okay.
The students who do the best on reading comprehension typically mark very little or not at all, because it takes time to write things down. It takes time to read them. And we do have, of course, this very severe time constraint. Well, Talia, I hope this has been helpful for you. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
I think the biggest insight would be first in terms of how I could tackle LR, in terms of understanding what I'm looking for. Because I think I already knew, for example, like my strategy for assumption questions, but I think one of my big things was realizing what I would do when I have those last two questions, or how to then approach it, or maybe even just going with my gut. And I think also another major takeaway I would have is reading comp. In terms of like, maybe like, not even maybe, I'll definitely practice just identifying the main conclusion and like trying to stray away from highlighting everything or taking so many notes, because I think that's definitely what takes up a bunch of my time, and like then that leads to like some frustration and then like rushing. And so I think those are two things that I'll definitely try.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.
Yeah.